The voting has been completed.
The dawn of a Palestinian state has been a long time coming. After 65 years of dispossession, 45 years of occupation, and 20 years of failed peace attempts,
your support for our endeavor today will send a promising message.
what does non-member status bring the Palestinians? In the shadows of more destruction, a brutal blockade, and expanding Israeli settlements, what prospects for peace?
Unfortunate and counterproductive resolution.
I am Marwan Bishara, and this is Empire. Welcome to Empire. The numbers are well known, but they tell only part of the story. 138 countries voted in favor of UN recognition of a Palestinian state as a non-member observer. 9 voted against and 41 abstained. Predictably, the United States brought along its diplomatic mercenaries. The Marshall Islands, Micronesia, Palau, and Nauru, by the way, a population of 10,000, smaller than the smallest of the Palestinian refugee camps. It also brought along the larger satellites, Canada, Panama, and the Czech Republic. And to add another twist, 15 of the abstaining states have already extended diplomatic recognition to the Palestinian state. In other words, only 1% of the world stood by US-Israeli rejection of a Palestinian state. Some have concluded, perhaps cynically, that this doesn't or shouldn't change anything on the ground, or that it's merely an exercise in expediency by its proponents and opponents alike. Be that as it may, a state is born. To discuss what next for Palestine, we're joined by Peter Barnard, author of The Crisis of Zionism, professor of journalism and political science at City University of New York, and senior political writer at The Daily Beast. Ethan Bronner is the national legal affairs correspondent at The New York Times and its former Jerusalem bureau chief, who also served as deputy foreign editor. Rashid Khalidi is a professor of history and the Edward Said Professor of Modern Arab Studies at Columbia University. He's the author of several books about the Middle East, including the forthcoming Brokers of Deceit: How the US Has Undermined Peace in the Middle East. And last but not least, Tony Caron is the senior editor of Time magazine, who writes extensively on Middle East and world affairs. A historic day for Palestine, and one step closer to joining the community of nations. 138. The United Nations General Assembly overwhelmingly voted to upgrade it to a non-member observer state.
Your support for our endeavor today will send a promising message to millions of Palestinians on the land of Palestine.
It's a recognition of its historic claims for statehood, and based on the Palestinian territories occupied since 1967, encompassing the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and the Gaza Strip. And predictably, the United States and Israel opposed the move.
Today's unfortunate and counterproductive resolution places further obstacles in the path to peace.
Mr. President, this resolution will not advance peace.
The threat of a US veto ended a similar attempt at the Security Council last year.
Peace is hard work. Peace will not come through statements and resolutions.
The Palestinians should first make peace with Israel and then get their state.
For decades, Palestinians have been told to be patient, that peace is just around the corner.
Peace will only come when Palestinians and Israelis sit down and talk to each other.
That within 3 months we would want to see significant progress on borders and security.
We are meeting to talk about the way forward. More to come.
But how many corners do we need to turn?
We have to sit together, negotiate together, and reach a mutual compromise in which a demilitarized Palestinian state recognizes the one and only Jewish state.
With Netanyahu pushing him to the edge, Abbas defied Washington in order to save his authority and leave a legacy. Since signing the Oslo Accords in 1993, he's rarely stood up to the United States. Time after time, we saw the so-called peace process launched and relaunched.
The descendants of Isaac and Ishmael have embarked together on a bold journey.
Again and again.
I believe now is precisely the right time to begin these negotiations.
Two states living side by side.
A relaunched and revitalized, renewed negotiation. That's the best thing.
Time has never been on the Palestinian side. With each new round of negotiations came more settlement expansion and a Palestine divided into smaller and more separated enclaves. And for the last 4 years, even the illusion of negotiations has disappeared under Netanyahu and Obama.
And I understand that how they feel in the absence of a peace process and looking at the prospects of a peace process with a future Israeli government. And that seems, from their point of view, bleak.
And with every new turn, the role of the US as an honest broker became more and more of a fantasy.
So there should not be a shred of doubt by now. When the chips are down, I have Israel's back.
Instead of moderating the Israeli position, US unconditional support bolsters Israeli hardliners and fuels hostility towards the Palestinian people, making a two-state solution ever more difficult. But increasingly, others in the region have the Palestinians back.
We will continue to work next to the Palestinian people, supporting them until they get all the rights with their free will for all the Palestinians.
I think that this time the situation is completely changed now. Egypt is not a mediator. Egypt now, I think they came in our side.
The Arab revolutions have Israelis on edge.
It just reinforces pre-notions that Israel had about this is a very, very bad neighborhood.
With a new confidence, both on the ground and in the diplomatic arena, while the Palestinians remain divided, after decades of dispossession, occupation, and humiliation, the Palestinians' struggle for independence in a state with Jerusalem as its capital survives, and so do Israeli attempts to prevent it. But the birth of a Palestinian state only begins when an occupation ends. So must the Palestinian dream of a state be Israel's nightmare? And is there still a path to a two-state solution? Gentlemen, welcome to Empire. Rashid, you're our historian. There's been a lot of political noise about this vote. Is it historic?
It's historic because it means that an overwhelming majority of the world's countries clearly believe that there should be a Palestinian state, something which hasn't happened and doesn't look like it's going to happen. So it's not historic in terms of changing anything on the ground, but I think it reinforces the sense that the Palestinians really do have an enormous amount of support out in the world.
And the U.S. was left out?
Yes, the U.S. was left out, that's true. I mean, the American power in this conflict has always been based on whether America could create a meaningful peace process that was likely to come to fruition. The Obama administration has not had any success in that. I believe that there are forces in Israel who want that. In fact, one of the striking things was, as we reported on our blog, Open Zion, was that Ehud Olmert actually endorsed the Palestinian UN bid, which I think shows that there are forces in Israel who actually would be sympathetic to the kind of negotiations that could bring about a Palestinian state. But since they're not in power in Israel now, America's ability or willingness to bring that peace process to bear, I think, has shown itself to be very limited.
But speaking of your blog, but you also wrote about the danger of this step.
Well, I think that the danger is that, remember, Abbas comes in a very weakened position because of the Gaza war. So on the one hand, this is partly a card to try to strengthen his hand. But the danger is if the Israeli and congressional retaliation actually weakens him further in the West Bank, then I think what could be a plus for him politically, especially vis-a-vis Hamas potentially, becomes a minus.
Ethan, I don't see any punishment of the Palestinians. If anything, the Palestinians are doing their best in order to save Israel's security interests in the West Bank. Why would the United States punish the Palestinians now?
The American and Israeli argument has been that this is a dangerous diversion, that it makes much more sense to drive the two sides toward bilateral negotiations. See, there's a long Palestinian response to that, but nonetheless, that is the argument in Israel.
Diversion from what?
Diversion from the need to talk to one another. Okay, in other words,
which hasn't happened for the last 4 years.
Indeed, it hasn't. Now, the American and Israeli argument is Israel is ready, and Palestine is refusing to join them at the table. The Palestinians say we'll only be willing to join them at the table if they stop building settlements, because that land is the land we want to build our state on. And all these years that we've been having this conversation, the population of settlers has tripled, and where are we? So that's where that's the sort of stalemate. Meanwhile, there is already an announced punishment, if you like. The Israeli Inner Cabinet on Thursday, at the same time that the UN General Assembly was doing this, decided to add 3,000 more housing units and to start dealing with the infrastructure in what's known as E1 next to Ma'ale Adumim, which, if they ended up going forward, would in fact cut the West Bank in such a way that a viable state seems impossible.
So, Tony, the Palestinians get a legal endorsement for the state. The retaliation by Israel is illegal settlements, expansion in the West Bank. How does that sound here?
I think the background here is that what this really is a vote of no confidence by the international community in what has been a US monopolized peace process. Essentially, in the Oslo years, the US basically says to the wider international community, we've got it, we'll take it from here. Plainly, 20 years later, that is no longer the case. Nobody can really believe, outside of the sort of rhetoric that you hear in domestic US statements, that this is somehow interfering with the peace process.
It's bad for the peace process.
Well, there is no peace process, and that's essentially what the vast majority of US allies, I mean quartet allies, who voted, who abstained in that vote, are basically saying, look, there is no process. Let's not kid ourselves. The problem here is not that the two sides aren't talking. They've talked plenty. The problem is that there's no agreement on where the border will be drawn between these two states and on what terms there will be this partition.
Rashid, do you think the Obama administration will accept to abandon the monopoly over the peace process and hand it over to some international body?
No, but I think Tony is right. I think this whole structure is completely bankrupt. The United States is such an uneven-handed broker that it is utterly unfit and should be disqualified from being the only mediator. It's proven that amply. And the fact that the American domestic debate is so skewed in favor of Israel means that if things are left to that, there will be absolutely no movement. There has to be pressure from outside. I think that's what the world community is signaling. I think that's what has to be signaled if there's going to be a change, both from within Israel and from within the Arab world and from among the Palestinians.
But not all pressure is created equal. Right? There is certain kinds of pressure that I think could push Israel in the right direction. Certainly with elections coming in January, realizing that the path that Benjamin Netanyahu's government on is leading Israel to isolation. There are other kinds of pressures that I think could lead the Israeli center to move right. And so I think one has to think carefully about what kind of pressure, it seems to me, is actually going to move the process forward.
But Peter, if it didn't happen the last 4 years, why would it happen in the next 4 years?
I think what's happening in the larger Middle East is going to have an impact. But again, it also depends on how it's perceived in Israel. Is the perception that you have leaders who are actually trying to move towards the two-state solution, which also means Palestinian concessions as well, and that they recognize that? Or do you have the perception that essentially that there is an increasing unwillingness to even accept the reality of Israel's existence at all? And I think that will impact the way it plays in Israel.
What amazed me, Ethan, is that the obsession wasn't really so much about the peace process in terms of this step at the United Nations. It was whether the Palestinians now are going to go to the International Criminal Court and sue Israel. There was absolutely no attention being paid to the fact that maybe Israel should stop violating international law and then hence not worry about any sues.
Well, I mean, the Israeli argument would simply be, we're not violating international law the way we read it, but we know that the world is against us, that the international lawyers have set things up to cause us trouble. And so we know already the International Court of Justice in The Hague declared the barrier that they've been building a violation of international law, which they reject.
That makes them anti-Israeli, or that makes them...
I'm not going to take the argument for Israel, but their argument...
You are our legal affairs correspondent.
That's right. Legal affairs and international law are not always the same thing. But look, what they would say is these international legal fora are basically going to screw us. We don't accept the way it is viewed, and that's why we don't want to take the risk of this happening. Yeah, they think that there is a kind of political bias against them, and you know, I mean, they basically are pursuing what they see to be their interest. And what you guys said about how the changes in the Arab world could change the way Israel views its situation.
No, I said it could change the way Washington views the situation.
And Peter thought that perhaps it could as well with Israelis. I'm unfortunately pessimistic that that could happen, and I think that the way they see what's happening is greater chaos, greater threat, and greater fury toward Israel, not greater let's cut a deal. You know, and that's a problem for them.
You know, what amazes me, Tony, is that, first of all, Israel itself is a byproduct of a United Nations resolution in the General Assembly.
It's very interesting. I mean, in some ways, one thing that you're dealing with here is that Israel has never really decided where its own borders end. Then you see what happened after '67. There's no consensus in Israel that says we can't go and settle there because we haven't decided what part of Eretz Israel is going to be ours and which we're going to give up. And so it's been, you know, this open-ended expansion where, you know, we'll stop when we have to, essentially. So, you know, not to usurp our historian, but it's worth thinking about why did Rabin go along with Oslo? Why were the Israelis in sort of 89 to 91 suddenly thinking about, you know, territorial concessions?
As much as I think the first Intifada helped to be part of what created the Oslo process and the shift in Israel to the left, right? The second Intifada also pushed Israeli politics to the right. And so that's why I think that I think it's very likely that there will be some increased international and regional pressure on Israel and from the Palestinians in the year to come. What I think is so desperately important is that it is nonviolent, because I think that will have a very important impact on how these processes play out.
There's a different reading for this. And the reading is that since the 70s, since Likud took over in the late 70s, until today, most of the governments in Israel were actually on the right. And that the only time when there was a bit of shift to the left, when there was American pressure on Israel back in 1991, 1992.
W. Bush, with the settlement.
When he said, call us at the White House. So in fact, Israel has been moving to the right from the mid-70s since the 1973 war, in fact.
Well, it depends, though, right? I mean, remember, Yitzhak Rabin never endorsed the idea of a Palestinian state, right? Benjamin Netanyahu actually has. Now, obviously, we could have a conversation about whether he's sincere and what he means by that, but the funny duality in Israel is that rhetorically, the idea of accepting a Palestinian state has become much more mainstream, right? A revisionist Likudniki to accept, whereas in many other ways, Israeli politics has moved to the right.
But does he really mean a Palestinian state when he says Palestinian state?
I personally argue, but I don't think he means by a Palestinian state what most of the rest of us
well, then we rest our case, right?
By a Palestinian, but go ahead.
No, finish.
No, I think that I wouldn't discuss. I think that the other difference between the 1990s and today, which one has to remember, is this was a period where America was at the peak of its power. The Soviet Union had collapsed, right? China's rise was embryonic. We had just won the Gulf War. America's power has significantly declined in the Middle East vis-a-vis then, and so that's another reason I think this moment is very different.
I think the key is not really in Israel. I mean, I think it's very important that there be a positive change in Israel. I think the key is here in this country. I think that as long as the United States has not got some kind of compulsion in terms of its vital interests in the Middle East that impel it to deal in a much more balanced way with this issue, the Israelis are not going to see where their bread is buttered. If you go back to '92, one of the reasons Rabin comes into power is because Israelis saw this government, this Likud government headed by Shamir, is messing up our relations with Washington. That's one reason Barak was elected at the end of the 90s. Right. And that's one of the things that will help change Israeli public opinion.
But certainly Obama missed a chance on this over the last 4 years.
But I mean, my concern is that, while I agree with you that without a change in the United States it won't happen, if you look at how Obama and the people around him felt when they came in 4 years ago and how they feel now, I don't see any reason for optimism. I think that 4 years ago they came in and they looked at the Palestinian-Israeli situation, and they said, this is going to be our top priority. It was absolutely their top priority. They named George Mitchell the first thing he did in foreign policy, and he looked at it, he said, it's solvable, it's urgent, and it will affect everything that happens in the region. And I think 4 years later, they look at it and they say, it's not solvable. It doesn't seem that urgent.
I agree. I don't think this administration is going to do anything. And I don't necessarily think you're going to have democratic governments in the Arab world in the next year or two or three. But you know, it's saying that will be the thing that might impel them finally to look to their interests.
Perhaps it's because,
as the United States.
Perhaps it's because all based on a certain fallacy, which is we leave it to the parties to negotiate peace. How could you leave it to a powerful occupier, a nuclear state, and basically powerless occupied people to negotiate a just peace.
Because how do you force them to?
But you don't. I mean, the idea is leave it to the party to reach a peace.
No,
That's
the
the
US has
American.
done more than that. I mean, the US
No,
has
that's the
done-
American position.
Yeah, the US has
the
done
American
more than
position
that.
is leave
the
it to
US
the
has
parties.
put its fat finger on the thumb in favor of the stronger party.
Yes, but as you also yourself know, America actually twice in the 1990s basically moved to bring down Israeli governments that we thought were not more willing to be part of a peace process. I think the problem was, look, Bill Clinton, I think the problem was that partly that Barack Obama never had a domestic political alternative to Benjamin Netanyahu in the way that Bill Clinton and George H.W. Bush did. So partly his ability to exercise leverage in Israel was limited by the fact that Israeli politics, unfortunately, had moved in the wake of the Second Intifada and the Gaza.
But Tony, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah.
Here you have the biggest backer of Israel ever, admittedly, publicly, privately, in every possible way, militarily, psychologically, politically, and psychologically is very important. Why would it be an honest broker in this peace process?
No, exactly. I think, you know, the other difference between now and 1991, really, is if you think about, you know, when we talk about what is the domestic pressure for the US to skew towards Israel in its dealing with this issue, it's not simply AIPAC. It's, I would say,
Israeli lobby.
The Israeli lobby, or the traditional Israeli lobby. The difference is that the Christian right in 1991 was Pat Buchanan. Pat Buchanan is no fan of Israel, as we all know. The Christian right today is evangelical Christian Zionists who, if anything, are far more hawkish on Israel than most Jewish Americans are. In fact, they're certainly far more hawkish.
Which I would like, which I would like to bring us back to the United Nations, the U.S. vis-a-vis the UN. Who is better to really manage this process than the international community, than the United Nations, than a new version of quartet? Because, you know, it actually boils down to some old cliche, you know, the might of right and the right of might. I mean, that's really what's boiling down to.
But I think there's one thing I wanted to respond to. You said, Marwan, about why rely on the U.S. to do it, okay? I agree it's a problem. But the thing is that Israel's interests, right, properly defined by many, include a viable Palestinian state. That's why it isn't a problem, or it wasn't seen as a problem in the 90s, to have this power and this great backer of this country be the one making it happen. Okay?
But who says it's an Israeli interest? Certainly not Netanyahu and not Lieberman.
Well,
not
actually,
the Israeli right.
In theory, they do say it. Okay. Peter certainly says it. Many people in Israel certainly say it.
The majority of Israelis will say that they support a Palestinian state. Now, they don't mean by that what the Palestinians mean by a Palestinian state.
But there may not be that big a difference. I mean, if we're talking about border discussions or 500 meters there or here, I mean, that can't be the big problem.
Yeah,
right?
we're all in a straitjacket. We're in a straitjacket that a man named Menachem Begin devised, and it was devised to prevent a Palestinian state. And that is the basis of the Oslo Accords, that's the basis of the so-called peace process, and that's why we're never going to get anywhere with this whole approach. The thing has to be tossed out.
Peter, hold that thought. We need to pause for a news break, and when we come back, we'll backtrack towards the latest conflict in order to further explore the road ahead. Welcome back with my guests, Peter Barnard, Ethan Bronner, Rashid Khalidi, and Tony Caron. One must break out of the news cycle to better understand the recent surge of political and diplomatic escalation at the United Nations and in the Middle East. No place provides a better reality check and context than the Gaza Strip. Last week, it was déjà vu all over again in one of the most overpopulated and impoverished strips in the world. Crippled by terribly high unemployment and a humanitarian crisis because of the Israeli blockade, the Gaza Strip is home to 1.7 million Palestinians, 80% of them refugees from the areas right across the border in Israel. Ironically, these are the same areas that were hit by rockets launched from Gaza. Nicole Johnston, who reported from Gaza over the last 3 years, provides some context.
A sense of calm has returned to the streets of Gaza. But still, the situation here is far from normal. Gaza has been under Israeli occupation for more than 40 years. For the last 10 years, its borders have been gradually closed and the Strip sealed off from the rest of the world. And for the last 6 years, it's been under a total Israeli siege. Armed groups in Gaza say they are fighting against the blockade and constant incursions by the Israeli army.
أولا الحرب لم تنتهي بعد، أن هذا العدو لا يحترم تعهداته، ونحن من خلال تعاملنا معه خلال السنوات الماضية مدركين جيدا أنه يمكن أن يخترق أي اتفاق حتى لو وقع عليه وضمنه قوة عظمى يمكن أن يخترقه. هذا العدو لا يوجد له عهد ولا ميثاق.
The battle between Israel and Hamas isn't a war between equals. The Israelis have tanks, a navy, F-16 fighter jets, drones and a missile defense system. Hamas and Islamic Jihad have anti-tank missiles, short and long-range rockets, of which they fired more than 1,000. In the lead-up to the escalation between Israel and Hamas, the leader of the Al-Qassam Brigade, the military wing of Hamas, had been negotiating a long-term truce with Israel. But Ahmed Jabari was assassinated before a deal could be reached. The reaction in Gaza was huge. Rocket fire from the Strip intensified. Hamas had to fight back or risk losing credibility with the other resistance groups.
Hamas was preparing for this war, and Hamas will not hesitate to strike back against Israel if Israel does not respect or violates the ceasefire agreement with the Palestinians.
In Gaza, a government compound was destroyed. This textile factory was attacked. 3 brothers and their families lost their life's work.
أكيد إحنا كنا يعني قوة وأمل في إنه نعيد بناء المكان، وهذا المكان يعني له 30 سنة تم بناؤه على يد الآباء والأجداد، فيعني يعتبر كشغل للعائلة كلها.
The government of Hamas estimates 20,000 homes were damaged or destroyed. 3 apartment buildings in Jabalia refugee camp were leveled. 100 people made homeless.
الآن أصبحنا مشردين، واستأجرت بيت ضيق ما يسع يعني ل4 أشخاص، لكن لا أقول لا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله. والبيت هيتعمر يعني متى هيتعمر؟ ولو تعمر البيت مش هيرجع زي ما كان يعني.
Most of the people in Gaza's refugee camps are 2nd and 3rd generation refugees. Their families fled here during the 1948 war with Israel. More than 1 million people in Gaza are refugees. The last war in Gaza started in the winter of 2008. It lasted for 3 weeks. There seems no end to the cycle of war here. People start to recover from one battle and a new one begins. Life here is constantly uncertain and planning for the future is almost impossible. I first worked in Gaza in 2010 after Israel killed 9 Turkish activists on the Mavi Marmara ship, which was attempting to deliver aid to Gaza. Israel then promised to ease the siege. For months we reported on Israel allowing more goods into Gaza, but still people could not leave or export goods. Israel said it was for security reasons. Then I came back and spent last year living in Gaza. Hamas hoped a new Egyptian government would permanently open the Rafah border crossing and pressure Israel to end the blockade. And now the latest ceasefire is meant to include an easing of the border restrictions. But people have heard it all before.
Israel should decide on this, whether they want to end this collective punishment, which is also, I believe, it's beyond being only a collective punishment. There is a de-development process, as if you are taking this piece of land and throw it backward 30 or 40 years.
Hamas is celebrating its campaign against Israel and its support from Cairo. The fighting appears to have strengthened Hamas. It's no longer the isolated international pariah it once was, but it's still unclear whether this will lead to an easing of relations between Hamas and its political rival Fatah.
So Rashid, it certainly doesn't look good on the ground. And what we've heard from Abbas at the United Nations was pretty severe. I mean, he spoke pretty high tone about racism, colonialism, complicity with the occupation, and so on and so forth. But he definitely carries a small stick.
I think that the day of the Ramallah-based Palestinian Authority, sooner or later, is over. I think that whole approach has failed in Palestinian eyes. I think that we're hopefully going to see what seems to be developing, which is a Egyptian, Arab, Turkish brokered reconciliation between Palestinian factions. That is the desire of most Palestinians. And they are utterly fed up, both with Hamas and with Fatah and Ramallah.
And you think it's becoming more feasible?
I think it is more feasible. I think that the extraordinary decline in the authority, prestige, and legitimacy of the people in Ramallah is making it inevitable. Hamas has gotten a boost,
so
not
that
just
would
by
make Hamas
this.
the senior partner in this reconciliation?
Hamas is much stronger right now than Fatah, yes, absolutely. There's more weight to Fatah than it appears because it's so bankrupt in terms of its strategy and its approach. But it has more weight than it appears. I think that that's what's going to be coming sooner or later. It may take a much longer time than it should. If the Palestinians had anything to do with it, it would have happened long ago.
And could a Hamas-led Palestinian organization talk peace with Israel?
They've said they want Abbas or someone else to negotiate for them for a government.
The PLO is the one that negotiates.
Yeah, in any case, it's the PLO. It's not the PA.
Not the PNA.
The PA is not sovereign, has no jurisdiction, has no authority.
But they also have to be able to they haven't been clear whether, even if there were an agreement, whether they would see that as permanently binding on them, and that ambiguity,
They
I think.
say that there has to be a referendum, and if the people vote for it, they would go for it.
I've some statements. I've seen other statements which even suggest that even that could also be renegotiated.
You know, I think two points, and the one is that the reconciliation would involve bringing Hamas into the PLO to make the PLO truly representative of all Palestinians. So it might change the equation. But I think just as the Israelis haven't, among themselves settled the question of where their borders are, Hamas clearly is faced with a very important internal debate and split right now. And you can clearly see there's an orientation among some Hamas leadership, Mishal, etc., towards the sort of Turkey, Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, Qatar sort of thinking, which is not about violence, it's not about predominantly military strategy. And there's clearly a preference among some, I don't want to paint this very crudely, but some of the Gaza leadership are more inclined towards Iran and the military support they get from Iran, and to keep the military option on the table. That is obviously going to play out partly by the possibilities that are presented to the movement, and also by the sort of role that its newfound partners, on whom it really is becoming increasingly dependent, are playing in guiding the movement. But clearly they're not going to support Hamas firing rockets.
If you hear Khalid Mish'al's latest speech, he definitely speaks about a totally new type of struggle against Israel, backed by new Arab friends and allies. I think Hamas is looking for a different type of struggle until the very last.
At least that current in Hamas.
Yes,
Tony's right. There's Hamas and there's Hamas.
Yes, I think the regional context is different. But I mean, what the footage that you showed didn't show was what's been happening in Israel, right? So the trauma in Gaza is greater numerically, there's no question about it. But when Israelis think about what this Fatah-Hamas reconciliation means, what it means to have Hamas in control in the West Bank, what they think about is what your footage didn't show, which is the trauma in southern Israel from Hamas and other Palestinian groups' rocket fire. And then the immediate question they're going to ask that I think one has to be able to answer if one wants to have any credibility in Israel is, how do we make sure that that's not going to happen also in the West Bank? And that's what I think is part of going to be
By the way,
the answer here.
just for the clarification, Al Jazeera does anything but report only from Gaza. We're the only ones actually
no,
report
I'm
from
only
both
speaking
sides.
about that particular clip.
And we did that because we actually want to talk about the future of Gaza.
Yes, which is important,
and the
but it
future
has to
of
be
Palestine.
seen in a larger context. Yes.
And in this larger context, can we really make that contrast? Can we make that symmetry between what's happening in Israel?
I'm not saying that the amount of suffering is equal. I'm not saying that. But I'm saying to understand the politics of it, you have to understand there has been tremendous trauma in Israel as well, and that's part of the reason there was so much support for this military.
So how do we explain then when there wasn't that trauma before, when there was no Hamas, when there was no rockets, when there were no suicide bombers? How then do we explain the Israeli position
I'm
then?
not saying that the trauma from Hamas rocket fire is the only political variable in Israel, not by any means. But I'm saying that you have to understand, to try to act as if that variable is not there, is to misunderstand Israeli politics, and I think is to lack empathy.
You were
no. I mean, I think that Peter's making an important point, and I think that it's a little hard to imagine the world, at least in the next 2 years or 3 years, getting behind a PLO that's Hamas-led in a negotiation with Israel.
You know, guys, let me say something. I mean, I would much rather that the Palestinians didn't have to deal with an Israeli government that's rooted in the terrorism of the Irgun and rooted in the terrorism of the Stern Gang. I mean, we sat down at Washington and Madrid with Shamir. Blood on his hands from here to here. UN blood, America, I mean, all kinds of blood. And it's really not for Israel to choose who they sit across the table from. They can have an influence on the ground rules. Everybody has to have an influence on the ground rules. But this assumption that we will exclude these, that's how the Madrid process, Oslo process, was hobbled at the beginning. Hamas is objectionable to the Israelis. Most Israeli political parties are objectionable to Palestinians. That's what represents the Palestinians.
No, look,
they want to deal with them. That's what they have to deal with.
Sort of arguing that they're objectionable to the rest of the world as well.
That's going to cease as soon as the kinds of things that you saw happening at the UN begin to percolate.
I'm sympathetic to Palestinian reconciliation, partly because I believe that democracy in the Palestinian territories is absolutely essential, and we haven't had any in recent years. But I do think that
it's also essential because to get a deal, you need a consensus.
Yes.
It's also essential because a powerful political force that lost an election, as you said, can't be kept out. And it's also essential because that is the only thing that would encourage the evolution of Hamas in the direction that a lot of people want.
Yes, but I think what you said, you also said something about the ground rules being important, and it's important that those ground rules give people some reason to believe that we're not that the West Bank is not going to become a launching part for the kind of violence that we've seen from Gaza in recent years.
So, but in the process now, speaking of the West Bank, what it is becoming is a proliferation area for Israeli settlements, and that's where Ethan started our conversation earlier, is that the Israeli government just threatened, or actually began, a new expansion of its settlements. Where does that take us on the West Bank?
Well, I think that sort of comes back to the question that Israel's unresolved borders, and Israel is, there's certainly a strong current, perhaps the dominant current in Israeli politics now, that sees the need to actually cement Israel's grip on the West Bank. And, it's been, Sharon's withdrawal from Gaza was very much designed to cement that grip on the West Bank.
But can there be a contiguous sovereign Palestinian state with the expansion of the settlements?
No, I don't think so. I mean,
so it's not just about borders.
There can be one with what you have now.
I don't think that.
So it's not just about borders.
No, I don't think there's much prospect for the realization of the two-state solution on the basis of the current political geography. And my own feeling is it might have actually changed too far. It might be the changes on the ground might be too irreversible. And the changes in Israeli domestic politics, it might. I mean, I think we still imagine an Israeli military that's capable, or an Israeli political leadership that's capable of going into settlements where people believe they have every right to be there. And they might be second generation because they really have been there for that long, and move them out. And I don't think that's realistic anymore.
Ethan, you've been in Jerusalem recently. You covered it for 4 years or so. What do you think?
I think that Tony is right. I think that we are very well likely beyond a time when we could imagine a contiguous Palestinian state existing in what you might hope to be West Bank, Gaza, and parts of East Jerusalem. I agree with you. I think that it's hard to imagine the number of Israeli Jews who would have to be moved from their homes in the West Bank back into what would then be Israel. It's hard to imagine any Israeli government having what it takes to move that number of people from their homes in a society that is so home and land obsessed.
And yet, so basically,
yeah.
So basically, Peter, the world says what it must, but Israel will do what it wants.
Well, I think there have been there have been times. I mean, look, 4 years ago, and that seems like an eternity away. But both Abbas and Omer have said that they felt they were months away from cutting a deal. Omer went far beyond where Ehud Barak had gone. Mahmoud Abbas also went very, very far. And now the question, so I don't think it's inconceivable to say that those two could have reached a deal had they both been able to stay in power for longer and had the U.S. been playing and other. But I think the question, then you're saying that they couldn't have brought it to, they couldn't have implemented it.
Couldn't they have sold it? Could they have sold it to
already
inside?
But they already signed 7 deals. They signed 7 agreements.
Yes, but they didn't sign a final agreement on
what I mean, not a single one of them was actually implemented.
I think what you have to do is you have to look at the fact that it's a mistake to say a majority of Israelis want this and a majority of Israelis want that. I think you should actually look at what the Israeli government spends its money on, what the Israeli government has over decades been doing. And there is a settlement industrial complex which, whatever the nature of the government in Jerusalem may have been, has been inexorably building, expanding, along the lines of a strategy which is designed to make a two-state solution impossible.
That's right, and an Israeli government behind
my
would have to
question,
confront
therefore,
that.
my question, therefore, is what politician, Rabin himself couldn't do this, what politician is there who's willing to stand up not just to now 1 in 10 Israeli Jews who live in settlements, counting the West Bank and Jerusalem, but this very powerful, not just lobby. I mean, we're talking about tens, hundreds of thousands of people whose livelihood depends on control of the Palestinians, depends on not just the settlements, the whole occupation, the matrix of control, as Amir
so then let's be realistic.
I don't see it happening, is what I'm saying.
So you have dispersed Palestinians, mostly in refuge, you have dispersed territory, and you have disunited leadership.
Well, the first thing the Palestinians have to do is get their act together. I think any Palestinian politician who is not talking about a new, imaginative, strategic consensus is not serving his or her people. That is an absolute necessity. There has to be consensus, unity, and a new strategy. The Palestinians are largely responsible for the mess that they're in. I mean, you can blame the Israelis and the United States until the cows come home. And I'm a critic of American policy, but the Palestinians, first and foremost, have to get their act together.
Ethan, otherwise, two-state solution is over?
I think it might be over. And I think that Rashid is saying something important, that because of the imbalance of power, you know, we tend to focus so hard on one side, and understandably, but there is a kind of dysfunctionalism in Palestinian political life over the last years, which is breathtaking and very depressing. I mean, even if we think that, you know, the vote in the UN was historic, and you think, well, it must have been important for the people in Palestine, there were 2,000 people in Ramallah celebrating. 2,000 people are in Yasser Arafat's square without celebrating.
But I think a lot of people were pleased just because even a minor symbolic.
I'm not saying they weren't
pleased.
What are you saying? What are you saying? What are you saying?
What I'm saying is that there is an exhaustion, a kind of existential exhaustion with politics, with political life, with organized endeavors in Palestine.
Loss of hope.
Entirely. Hope, but I mean, hope, it's almost a loss of a willingness to be engaged, to believe that there is a leadership that could do anything, and this is a very dangerous situation. It allows for power to run roughshod over them.
But I think the United States bears some of the responsibility of that, because we have been opposed to allowing elections, and how are you going to have legitimate leadership and open politics unless you can have elections?
I just want to say, when you said at one point Israel is a product of the UN, I disagree with you. It is true that the UN gave it some premature in the 47 vote, but the thing about Israel is it's a product of its own endeavors, largely. Now, they're not all beautiful endeavors, but honestly, it's very hard.
A lot of external
I'm talking about the foundation of Israel.
UN.
The foundation of Israel was based on two things that actually the Israelis are recommending the Palestinians don't do. It was the byproduct of the United Nations General Assembly resolution, and second, force.
Well, actually, I think what Ethan's saying is there's something very important here, that if you look at Israeli history, if you were Benjamin Netanyahu's father, one of the, the original ideologue, Ben-Zion Netanyahu, one of the original ideologues of the revisionist movement, and you look at
personal secretary,
exactly,
no less.
And you look at 100 years of history, and you go, 100 years ago, none of this was possible. Right. There were 4,000 Jews in the world speaking Hebrew. Now you have, 7 million.
It's a great story. And it should be told in Arabic in the Arab world so people can learn, because it's a wonderful reconstruction
what's
of a
very
national
important
narrative.
here is that the UN prescribes the terms, but the movement that creates Israel has its own idea, and it takes it as far as it goes, and it moves beyond those. And a right-wing Likudnik will look at this and go, you've always told us we have to give this back, we have to give that back, we have to make that. What have we ever suffered for any of this? Oslo came along, you have to do this, you have to. We didn't do it. We built settlements. Where are we now? We're actually expanding, and there's no downside. And yes, I agree with Peter. The U.S. has enabled this in a major way.
A Jewish majority in the land of Israel.
Well, and also that the only way to convince the world, I believe, in the long term, of the legitimacy of the idea of Jewish self-determination is to show that it can also be reconciled, at least to some degree, with liberal democratic principles. Once that becomes impossible because you are permanently controlling millions of people who don't have citizenship or any basic due process, I think ultimately this will lead to Israel's pariah status, will ultimately be the undoing
Isn't
of
that the
Israel.
original sin? That you have self-determination of the Jewish people combined with colonialism?
Excuse me, but I think you have colonialism in the West Bank. I don't believe that, but inside is the Green Line.
No, we're talking about 1905.
You have citizenship. You have citizenship. You have citizenship for non-Jews as well, which is something that many of some of the Palestinian refugees didn't even get in the Arab countries they went to.
Hence, you cannot call it Jewish and democratic at the same time, correct?
No, I think these are two. Look, in Britain, there is an Anglican head of state and a cross on the flag. There are many countries that have Christian symbols on their
There's
flag.
God in the United States, but it's not the state of the Christians.
The U.S. is different, but there are many countries in Europe that have some Christian identity and some privileged immigration policy for a certain group.
Peter, this liberal democratic thing, that's why the external support is so important. Israel has Israel. No, it doesn't matter. Israel was largely a function of the efforts of the Zionists, but it was also massively supported externally. The moment that liberal democratic vineyard disappears, that international support cannot be sustained in the long term.
You mean Western support?
American support. Let's be blunt. It's no longer Western support.
Eventually
the French voted for the Palestinians.
And
the British abstained.
eventually, to some degree, American Jewish support.
I just want to, put in a note of skepticism, and then you
can
wrap us up.
I'm sorry,
no,
Ethan, we're going to have to wrap it.
Okay.
Gentlemen, thank you for joining Empire. And I will be back with the final thoughts. The morning after the historic UN vote, the headlines of the American press reduced the birth of the new Palestinian state to another horse race. Blow to US, said the New York Times. Palestine won big, said Time magazine. And Boeing Fatah, said the Wall Street Journal. And there seems to be a pattern here, in birth as in death. And when it's always about losers and winners, it takes entertaining political comedy to gauge the media's response.
Who was the big winner, do you think, here?
There are two clear winners.
Who are the losers and who are the winners?
You really missed the election, don't you?
There's a military side of this, which Israel clearly won.
Oh, yes, Israel clearly won. Israel's in great shape now. There's no winners.
Hamas emerges as a big winner from this conflict.
Hamas is a winner here.
So Israel won and Hamas won. Did I say no winners? I meant two winners.
President Obama is a winner here. Netanyahu's a winner here. Hillary Clinton is a winner here.
Egypt has definitely emerged as the winner in all this.
Did anybody lose this thing? Did anybody lose? Did anybody actually lose in this bloody conflict that killed over 150 people?